Cool. Hi, everyone. My name is Naomi Dennis. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Ian. As sort of stated, I am a developer at Light out of their New York office. And so today my talk is about accessibility in web development. And so before we get like really into it, I thought it would be cool if I shared my inspiration for this talk, which came from my last project where I was working a lot with React and front end tools. And because at the time I wasn't very well versed in front end, I would look for different tips and tricks to sort of like help with things like responsive design. And I stumbled upon a blog post that talked about how accessibility can actually be integrated into the workflow of teams without it having to be something that is specifically designed for. And the reason for that is because usually a lot of businesses tend to put development for accessibility on the back burner because other features typically have higher priority. And so today we're sort of going to look into how teams can sort of integrate developing for accessibility into their workflows naturally without sacrificing too much time. And so one thing I want to do to frame this discussion is talk about affordances. And so affordances is actually something I heard from a talk by Rob Dobson. He's a developer advocate at Google. And the idea is to try to give the users a chance to try different things on the site that will help them understand how it works by using elements that they are already familiar with. And so these are things like if you have something that looks like a button, then it should behave like a button. Same with things that look like text boxes and so on and so forth. And the example that he used that I'm going to kind of take here because I think it's brilliant is a teapot. And so most people have seen what a teapot looks like or has worked with one before. And teapots don't normally come with instruction manuals because they're very simple. They usually come with the same three components. You have the handle, you have the casket where the water goes, and you have the spout. And so this is sort of the way that we should think about developing our sites and applications is we should try to develop it with a frame of mind that the user will be able to feel around to figure out how the website should be used without us explicitly having to tell them. If something is really complex, then it's okay to say something about it, of course, but as long as the language is clear and easy to follow. And then the last thing I sort of want to touch upon, but very, very briefly, is that the user shouldn't have to say like go to a third party to figure out how to use something on your site. It should be very obvious or at least somewhat obvious on what they should do. And an example of this being done sort of in a bad way is if you are using, say, a subscription service through something like Amazon or Netflix or Disney Plus, what have you, and you want to unsubscribe, usually they make the unsubscription button inaccessible because they don't want you to unsubscribe. And so that's something we don't want to do. And so some of the obstacles to accessibility that we're going to touch upon is there are obviously obstacles for people with physical disabilities. And specifically, we are going to touch upon visual impairments. And these are people that may have visual disabilities, something like cataracts, or they may have partial blindness. It may be a bit difficult for them to read certain things on the website if things are too close together because of dyslexia. And so that's something that we're going to touch upon, as well as technical limitations. And so technical limitations, I personally feel aren't really given enough attention because they're sort of like, they're a bit invisible. Um, and the things surrounding technical limitations are namely stuff like using legacy technologies such as desktops or like really old desktops, really old laptops, really old browsers, things like that, as well as network capability. And so sometimes, depending on where you are, you could be using a network that is very slow. And this is something that we should keep in mind as we develop. And then the last thing is language support. And so language support mainly touches upon like if the language on the site is clear and if the directions are clear and if like it does offer translation that should be something that should be easy for people to switch to depending on their preference. Oh, I see someone asked a question about the WCAG. Unfortunately, no. That was something that I realized I hadn't included sort of at the last minute, but there is a link that I see that you have there that I do share at the end. So I apologize for that.
Hey, Naomi, can you repeat that question for the people on Twitch?
Oh, sure. And so JM asked if this will cover the main elements of the WCAG. And unfortunately, we don't explicitly cover it, namely because that's something that I realized that I hadn't put in the presentation after I had finished writing it. But there is a link in the end to the page that has the guidelines on it. And for those of you that are in the Zoom room, it's pretty much the link that JM has shared. And so what are the solutions? What are the solutions what are the solutions to these problems or to these obstacles? So there's responsive design, which effectively it concerns itself with structuring the website depending on the size of the device that you're using. There's testing libraries, such as the DOM testing library that is used so that developers can develop with accessibility principles in mind. And then there are some other ones that we're going to talk about as we go through the presentation. And so the next thing we're going to go into before delving into an exercise is talking about who makes the rules for accessibility. And that is the Worldwide Web Consortium, or the WC3, or W3C, sorry. And so they create the foundational standards for the web. And they have this subset of themselves called the Web Accessibility Initiative that actually handles a lot of the accessibility references that developers would use to sort of figure out like how to use certain elements in a way that like assistive technology can see. And we're going to delve into this, but right before I do, I just wanted to mention the ALI project, which is a community-driven project that that sort of like they kind of have like a centralized place for a whole bunch of accessibility tools that people can use to sort of check to see if their site meets the accessibility standards, or to kind of gauge how accessible their site is. And so we're just going to, I have it up here. And so if we were to follow this link, which I have up here, this is sort of like one of the sources of truth for ARIA rules and anything regarding ARIA. And there are several documents like this, but this particular one is called the WAI ARIA. And so we're namely going to concern ourselves with the roles, as we've sort of prepared to look into how to test a website using using like a framework that encourages developing with accessibility roles in mind. And so there are two main features of these ARIA attributes. And so the first is the ARIA role that defines what the element is or what the element does. And many of these roles are named after their HTML ARIA roles and their semantics that are applied to the elements. So for example, you have like a button that has the role of a button, a link, and the role for that is a link, and a text box whose role is a text box. And then you have elements that can have multiple roles depending on the type of that element. So say if you have like an input element and it has a type of button, then that means that it would behave in an accessibility way in the same way that a button element would. Similar with radios and checkboxes. And so the other bit to this is are states and properties. And so states and properties kind of work in conjunction with each other, with the state sort of being like the value of the property. And so properties give elements extra meaning. And so although I haven't like really found anything to say that alt is explicitly part of ARIA, but typically image tags have an alt attribute, which is used for alternative text if the image fails to load. And so you can either use the like image alt alt attribute for alternative text, but there's also, as you can see, not here, but there's also, say, like the ARIA labeled by property that you can use, and then you can set that in a similar way to sort of like an alternate, sort of like a text, like sort of like a way to label elements if you, for whatever reason, don't want to use like the semantic HTML element. And so this reference is actually pretty dense. And I personally, when I was sort of working with implementing accessibility, I mainly used the MDN because it has a very easy and easily digestible reference to the ARIA rules for all HTML elements. And so you'll notice that, for instance, this is a div. This is the MDN help article for the div element. And you'll notice that it doesn't really have a corresponding role. So this is versus like, say, something like the button element, which has, obviously, it has like a button ARIA role, and then it also has a list of permitted roles that you could assign to it. And so for a div, you see that it's any, and this is mainly to say that divs and elements like it bring up an interesting point, where that not all HTML elements have default ARIA roles, properties, or states. Div elements are one of the elements that sort of like are like an open canvas. You can like make it accessible in a way that you see fit, depending on what you're using it for. Now, the only downside to this is that if you want it to be fully accessible, as in readable by any, like, say, assistive technology, is that you kind of become more responsible for assigning those ARIA attributes to it. And so that's why normally, if you're going to use, normally you would try to use like a regular like semantic HTML element versus a div if you can, if you're trying to make your site more accessible, because there's simply less work involved. And so let's see. And so now we will talk about exploring solutions to this. And so one solution that we can use is the DOM testing library. And so the DOM testing library is the DOM testing library is like a kind of like foundational testing library that can be used by various frameworks like React and Angular and Vue. And effectively, it's very useful for testing because it really encourages that the developer uses ARIA roles and accessibility traits to view the website from the user's perspective in order to test things like user interfaces. And so the way that it encourages it, we'll actually see in a moment. There's a small exercise that I created to sort of like investigate how the DOM testing library works in conjunction with the ARIA roles that we just explored. And so we'll just go to that now. And so on the left side here, you see that this is sort of like just a really, really basic website. There's just like a spinning logo. There's a description with an instruction for what we should do. And then we see two text boxes with labels and what appears to be a button. And so just with, what we're seeing here, we would guess, all right, so it wants us to like enter our name and an email. And then we should press the enter button, and then something should happen. And so when we press the enter button, we see this just thank you for your submission message. And it's pretty obvious what's going on. And so what we want to do is to ensure that this level of interactivity is also available to those that have either physical limitations or technical limitations. And so I'm going to refresh this. And on the code here, you'll notice that we're using the React testing library. This is how it's referenced if we're using like npm to install it. And we have like some commented test here just to sort of save some time. Which, let me just make this just a wee bit bigger. And cool. Oop. Okay, so let me just fix this really quickly. And cool. Okay, so before we get super into the testing way of things, there's actually a tool that I would like to show you guys. Actually, two tools that I would actually like to show you guys that would be useful when evaluating your site for accessibility. And actually, right before we get into this, sorry, I've kind of been not looking at the chat, the Zoom chat for those of you on Twitch. But JM actually brought up a very important point that I think is important, which is that accessibility, although like I know I'm kind of like taking a very light touch with it, is that in the overall scope of the internet, especially depending on what your business's like customer base is, like if you're making a more like government site and depending on the context that your site exists in, accessibility can be very important, and like so important that the law can come into play in terms of how accessible your website is and who can access it easily. So unfortunately, this talk will not be talking about sort of like that side of accessibility, and we're mainly sort of focusing on like tools that you can use and things that you should keep in mind when integrating accessible techniques into your workflow. So I just wanted to mention that in case anyone was waiting for it. Okay, and so let's continue. And so the tools that I wanted to bring up are tools to sort of like help develop for screen readers. And so the first tool is actually not on this browser, but the first tool is actually the Google's accessibility tree. And so Google has a very useful sort of addition to Chrome. I think it was added a few years ago, where you can kind of like interpret what the Chrome browser will give to assistive technologies. And so for those who don't already know, sort of like in a short description, the Google accessibility tree is a representation of the application in a form that, like, as I said, assistive technologies can use. And so if we were to say use a screen reader to use on the site, it would sort of read the site in a similar way that the accessibility tree will read it in. And so if I were to click it, we would see this generic tag here, which if we were to look at our code, we could sort of surmise that that's this div here. And so if we clicked it, we would see another generic tag, which would probably be this div main. And then if we were to click that, we would see, oh, okay, so never mind. So this, I was a bit too forward for this generic tag. So I believe this second generic tag is actually referencing the div with the class name app. And so under that, we can see the banner, which is this header here. And we can also see like an image, but there's no description. And so say if you couldn't see what the image was, you just know that a vague image is there. Similarly, if we were to look at like what's underneath the image, we know that there's a paragraph with some text. So that's pretty good. And then we see another paragraph with some text, which again, that's also pretty good. But then for everything else, there's sort of like, we know that there's a vague idea of text and then a text box with no real information in it. So the reader might have a bit of a hard time figuring out what this text box is referring to. Similarly, with this text box here. And then also for the button, it sort of just says text enter, which isn't really like descriptive of what it does. And it also doesn't say that it's a button. So if we were using a screen reader, then we would just know that there is a text that says enter on the screen with no real context of how we're supposed to use it. And so we can, fix this. And we can actually fix this with the help of React Testing Library. And so this is sort of like the big point that I sort of want to drive home with RTL. And you don't necessarily have to use React for this. Like, as I said, DOM testing library comes in many flavors for Angular and Vue. But say if if we were given this code and we wanted to make this more accessible, so it's like, where would we start? And so I've decided to sort of show this by starting from the top down. So starting from the logo. And so on this line, we're rendering the application. And then on this line, we're trying to query the application by the alternate text that we're expecting it to say React logo, and then we're expecting it to be in the document. And so how would we write this? Well, usually following test-driven development workflow, we would first run the test to see if it passed. And since we know the alt isn't there, it's probably not going to pass. And so yeah, it failed. And so if we were to simply add an alternate text to the end of this, and call it React logo, and then rerun the test, we will see that it passes. So great. But then what if we wanted to, just double check with the accessibility tree that it is interpreting the image with a description of what the image is. So we can kind of just inspect the image itself, and it says it's a banner, and the banner is an image, and the image is the React logo. So, so now that's more accessible to someone that may be using a screen reader. And so let's keep going down this list. And so say if we now want to move on to the text box. And so the text box here is sort of like in a div that's supposed to represent a form, and the form has spans and an input that's sort of supposed to represent this is where obviously where your name and this is the description of what the text box represents. And so for the screen reader or for the accessibility tree, I'll start saying it's not really obvious what this is. It can read the text, and it knows it says name, but it doesn't really know what relationship it has to the text box. As far as it's concerned, it's just completely separated. And so we can make this a lot clearer by simply adding a label here instead of using a span element. And giving the input an ID. And so if we were to run the test now, and so we see that it fails, namely because we're using React. And I forgot. So React actually for is a reserved keyword even for templating. And so usually we would use this HTML4 attribute versus the regular for. And then lastly, we sort of want to see that, okay, so our test might actually fail because it's expecting a different label name, but actually because the label name never changed, despite the fact that the element changed, the test still passes. So let's continue. on with the second text box. And so we'll do sort of like a similar thing as we've been doing. And so we will like uncomment to test it. And now that we've seen that it fails, because I want to sort of show sort of like how the React testing library is sort of like digesting the information that it's getting. And so you see here that it lists the accessibility roles that it can see. And so we have our header here, along with how it's seeing it, as well as our React logo from our previous test, the text box with like the name label. And so we are looking for a text box with the label as email. And so here it kind of just posts like the entire body of the page that you're working on. And so obviously we can see that our email box does indeed exist, and we can see that it exists in the code, but it's not really clear in an accessible way where it is or like what it says. And so we can change this in a similar way that we changed the name box. And so say if we were to name it something like email text box. And we were to give the inputs an ID of email text box. So now when we run the test, before it got me again. So let's try that one more time. And we see that it passes. And so there's actually something that I sort of want to show that I might actually save for the end of this presentation now that I think about it, which is there's a really cool Chrome extension that actually simulates a screen reader. And it's a really interesting tool to use in conjunction with the accessibility tree to sort of see how someone that's using a screen reader will be able to interpret your site. But I'll include links to that and a demonstration of that at the end of the talk. But for now, as we click through our site, so we still see a lot of generics that isn't really helpful in what these sections are supposed to be. But now we know that there's a label for a text box and its name, and then the label for a text box that's email. And so the last thing we really have to fix is this enter button here, because it still kind of says it's just a generic text. And so to do that, we're going to uncomment our last test and sort of see that it's looking for, okay, so this is something I forgot to mention. So one of the ways that the React testing library kind of like encourages using using accessibility roles, ARIA roles over just sort of using like IDs and stuff or class names is that they have this really nifty get by role helper function. And there are various like functions like this. There's get by role, and then I think there's also like a find all and a and other functions like that. But something to take note here is that we're referencing the ARIA role as the argument, as in we're looking for an element with an ARIA role of text box that has a label that is name. And it's the same for the email. And for the button, because it's not looking necessarily for a label in the same sense, but it is like the label of the button. We are now changing that to button, and we're looking for a button that has the value of enter and for it to be in the document. So if we were to just like simply just rename this from a div to a button, we were to save this and we were to like go back to our page here, then we would see that now this looks sort of like a lot better. We know we have 2 paragraphs, we know we have an enter button, but there's still a few generics here. And I think for these, because these are more like containers sort of, we don't necessarily need to like test that the tags equal to a certain thing, but it's always good to like change it anyway, just to ensure sort of like visibility on this and that it is like set to the like appropriate semantic tag. And so if we were to, for instance, change this from a div to a form, and then instead of just having the ID of main, we were to actually give it the main semantic tag, and we were to refresh our browser, now we would notice that our website's accessibility tree is a lot more readable. And so if we were curious to how a screen reader would interpret our site, then we would know that it would see like an overall generic container followed by an inner generic container that would contain a banner with an image, that's the React logo, followed by a main section that would have a paragraph with some text in it, another paragraph with some text in it, a form with a label and a text box, and another label and a text box, all with descriptive names on them, as well as a enter button. And so now this is a lot more readable for someone that is, say, using the site via a screen reader. And so that's kind of like the end of our exercise there. And so the next thing that I sort of want to talk about are technical limitations. Because now that we found a solution to developing for screen readers, while we create our applications, we can look into developing for those with technical limitations. And this means that, for instance, if someone doesn't have access to the latest devices, they're limited to only certain devices that may not have support that the website can offer. And for example, like those who use the internet only through mobile devices fall into this category of technical limitations because once upon a time, website screens just like the screens for websites or websites weren't anticipating people to come on the site with, say, like a screen that's about 325 or 340 pixels wide. They usually expected you to have at whatever standard desktop screen there was at the time, with like few variants in between. And so I think a really good category. So there are many solutions to this, and not all of them are things that like I'll necessarily show today. But like for instance, a really good example of a web application that sort of overcomes its own technical limitations or considers people with technical limitations, I think, is Zoom. Because like obviously during COVID, you have a lot of school-age children that are logging on to Zoom because of like, remote learning, and not everyone, and depending on the person, depending on their background, depending on their economic standing, they may not have access to, say, a laptop or a desktop computer for every single person of the household at the same time. And so you probably have a lot of school-age children like signing on possibly with phones to listen in on classes. In a way that sort of Zoom in a solution to overcoming this technical limitation is to also add things like phone apps. If your website makes it difficult to have like a mobile form of itself accessible through like the mobile version of Google or of Google Chrome or Firefox. And so something else to keep in mind are things like legacy browsers. There are like sort of like many different tools that can be used to sort of account for legacy browsers. And one of the things that I think like people that are knowledgeable in CSS tend to do is that each browser kind of comes with their own sort of like styling kit that is used for configuring the elements on their site. And so you'll see things like the Google like Chrome WebKit, and then Firefox has their, I think it's like MOZ kit, and then there's others for like Opera and Safari. But usually the main contender for dealing with legacy browsers is Internet Explorer. And we're actually going to go into that with our next slide. And the reason why considering this is important is because the groups that may experience this are actually quite wide. Like these can be schools that may not have the budget to accommodate for like a technical upgrade for all of their classrooms. Then there are like government facilities that sort of have to keep in mind that they need to access the most amount of people at a particular time. There are people in rural populations that live like really far away from any, say, like major internet like companies jurisdiction territory. And so say if you live way out in like the boonies in any particular state or any part of the world, it may be more difficult for you to sign on with a reliable internet service. And so when developing websites, it's sort of good to consider the amount of data that is downloaded on their that's downloaded via their browser on their computer over their internet. And then the last thing is the indigent population, which is just people that are economically disadvantaged and they may not have the resources to accommodate like the fastest or the best, or even like maybe even like a somewhat decent piece of technology to use for personal use or business use or school use. And so the solutions to this are things like responsive design. And so something that I wanted to sort of bring up with this was I wanted to use sort of like real world examples to sort of see how different like current sites sort of like try to anticipate accessibility, whether they meant for it to be just for people with phones can use it, or if they really meant for people that might have like, for instance, a lower network capability to be able to use their site effectively. And so up here, I have a few examples that are already in like, this is Chrome's responsive design mode, where you can sort of like simulate different viewports. And so like, so this is sort of like a standard, like standard-ish web resolution. And so we can see that it's pretty easy to scroll through. And if we were to say go to like the Moto G4, which has a very, very small viewport, even though everything is kind of closer together, it's still pretty legible. And so if you're ever wondering like, well, I don't really have a lot of time and I sort of just want to make sure that we cover the bare bones of accessibility, then I would strongly suggest using the ALI project checklist. And so the ALI project has just like a really basic checklist. It does not cover everything, but it's sort of just like what they call part of like their success criteria that sort of just covers the very basics of what you should do to get your website on the road to accessibility, to making your site more accessible. And so if we were looking at, say, like the CNN website, we can sort of look through, like scroll down to their, like for instance, or for this, in this particular case, just in the sense of time, their mobile or touch device checklist, then we could see like, does it rotate in any orientation? And this is something that we can simulate with Google's DevTools. And it looks like it can without sacrificing layout. We could also look at if they have horizontal scrolling, because this can be something that can impede someone's use of the site or make it a bit more difficult for them to use it. Like say if they don't have like complete control of their motor functions, or if they have like, some control over it, but maybe there might be like a twitch or something. And we see that it can kind of move to the side, but even if you try to move it really hard to the side, it still kind of stays centered. And so if someone was like that was using the site, it would still be like easy for them to use. And then they say like, that to ensure that the button and link icons can be activated with ease. And so this is something I think actually CNN fails at, because if you were, say, using this, depending on the device that you're using it for, you could sort of very easily like click multiple links, which I think are up here, sort of by accident. Although I think that their main menu sort of follows the separation of the links and buttons a bit more. And then finally, they have it, and so this is their the last bit, which is to ensure sufficient space between interactive items in order to provide a scroll area. And this is something that, as I said, I don't think that all of CNN is really good at. But just this sort of is an example to sort of see that even like a company like CNN that may not have accessibility 100% at the forefront, that just by adhering to things like responsive design, they're able to sort of like already create something that someone with a someone with an accessibility obstacle can overcome to use your site in an enjoyable way. And so, yeah, that's pretty much my entire talk. This certainly isn't everything. Their accessibility in web development is a wide topic with a lot of different things to sort of learn and to go over. And so I included like this resource slide just in case anyone wanted to sort of like look into more about accessibility and how to integrate accessibility into their workflows. I highly recommend, outside of like the more resource links up here, these two talks by Rob Dobson from Google and Marcy Sutton. Their talks sort of influenced this presentation, as they have a lot of very good resources and a lot of very good talks. Like these two are certainly not the only ones that they've done to sort of like bring people into the fold of accessibility and bring them up to date on the current accessible guidelines that are there.